I'd like to welcome you. My name is Barbara Thoreau. I'm the owner of Fact and Fiction, and it's my pleasure to have yet another meeting here in the Missoula Public Library. I'd like to thank the library for the use of their meeting room and Betty Ammons for being our camera person. This is being recorded for the Undercover Library Show. Dave Polly does a show once a month, and it will air, I think, tomorrow for the first time at 8 p.m. on MCAT. So, tonight's guest is Barnaby Conrad, who searched for his family roots and was looking for adventure, and I think he must have found more relatives than he thought he knew he had, and hopefully a lot of new friends along the way. He set out on a 5-month journey, 9,000 miles, and he must have had a good enough time that he's doing a shorter version when he's going around the state promoting his book, Ghost Hunting in Montana, a search for roots in the Old West. If any of you are here thinking this really is about ghost hunting, I'm sorry. These are the true ghosts of his relatives. But it is not just a travelogue. It's an entertaining account of the little-known part of America that he discovered and the colorful lives of people he discovered along the way. He reports an insider's Montana and discovered a little bit about himself and something more. I like a quote from the book itself. "We must seize what adventure we can from life, for the rest is of little consequence." So with that, I'll let Barnaby read from his book, Ghost Hunting in Montana.
Hi.
Hello.
I know about half the people on this side of the room. They're related to me. And I'm glad you're all here. I want to thank the library for inviting me, and the bookstore also. Without bookstores and without readers, writers would still be driving taxi cabs in New York or bucking bales in a field near Missoula. So I'm not sure that it was interesting to hear myself quoted. You still should pay your taxes and vote and send your kids to school. Adventure is not all it's cracked up to be, unless you meet someone that you love and you settle down eventually. You can just share adventures. But with that little philosophy, I'll just jump right in and tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book. My father took us to Montana instead of Wyoming or Idaho because my family was part of the state's pioneer history. My father's grandfather, John Howard Conrad, came to the territory in 1870 as a 14-year-old boy. He began by trading whiskey to the Indians, and in 2 decades became a renegade cattle baron, mining tycoon, and gubernatorial candidate. His son, my grandfather Barnaby, spent his youth on ranches and railroad gangs, and he married a Montana woman, Helen Hunt, who was born in Helena in 1889, the year of statehood. Ghosts were the reason for my trip. I was ghost hunting in Montana. For 5 months in 1989, the year of Montana's centennial of statehood, I journeyed 9,000 miles over Montana's dusty roads, through her snow-capped mountains, down her big rivers, up her box canyons, into her vast forests, and across her sagebrush flats, traveling wherever possible by horse or canoe. I was in search of first-hand adventure, family roots, and history still breathing in the carcass of myth. During my journey, I consulted a dog-eared manuscript, the memoir of my grandmother Helen's father, William Henry Hunt, who disembarked from a Missouri steamboat at Fort Benton in 1879. In that little town on the prairie, Hunt began his rise from a frontier lawyer and district attorney to Supreme Court Justice of the state. Judge Hunt was the beloved patriarch of my father's maternal side of the family. My 2 ancestors couldn't have been more different. Conrad was a rough-cut Southerner and Democrat. Hunt was a Yankee aristocrat and Republican. Conrad was an alcoholic, womanizer, high-stakes gambler, and millionaire entrepreneur, while Hunt was a solid family man, a gentleman and a trusted confidant of Teddy Roosevelt and President Taft. Where Judge Hunt's exemplary life remains cherished by our family, John Conrad's story, an ambitious journey tainted with alcoholism, adultery, and even murder, was rarely mentioned by his son, my late grandfather. When my father asked why he never spoke of John, my grandfather only replied, I didn't like the man. Why, I wondered, and why had our family left the state even when there was a town called Conrad, Montana? I decided to track these two ancestors across Montana, to measure their losses and triumphs against the historical backdrop of the West, and to find out how a vast Indian country had been transformed into a state rich in mining, cattle, and agriculture, and then gone into decline. At least that's what I told anyone who asked me. The real reason for the trip was more personal. I lived a privileged youth in San Francisco, far from the dust storms and blizzards of Montana. After Yale, I spent 6 years in New York as a magazine editor and 5 more in Paris as an art historian and travel writer. But Montana was always in the back of my mind. I was in Paris when my mother died suddenly. Grieving, I returned to America to assume dreary responsibilities and seek life among ashes. At 37, I was still unmarried and suddenly not feeling young anymore. I was also not feeling very American. Between New York, Paris, Zermatt, and Calcutta, I had become a chameleon, a citizen of the world, but also a man without a country. I mean, a real country, not the America concocted by USA Today. I needed to find the American inside myself. That summer, as the tourists jammed the foggy streets of San Francisco, I bought a used Jeep, packed my tent, pistol, and fly rod, and hit the trail for Montana. Actually, I kind of like this part. Ahead of me rumbled a gunmetal gray pickup with a black and tan shepherd perched in the truck bed. The dog's black gums were pulled back in a toothy smile as his nostrils sucked in an aromatic smorgasbord. Green hay, dead skunk, hot asphalt, cow manure, and musky coyotes that had passed in the night. Almost every pickup in Montana has a dog riding in the truck bed. Animal rights groups have tried to forbid this because occasionally a dog will fall out on a bumpy turn, but Montanans believe this kind of restriction would be unfair to the dogs. There's also a rifle suspended in the back window of every pickup, and the NRA sticker is ubiquitous. This is a land where firearms are not only a hunting tool, but an unapologetic symbol of ornery self-reliance. In the West, there's nothing more American than firing a bullet. On the radio came the voices of Montana. Sooner or later, you have to come down and face reality. Are you scared? Too dumb to be scared? Or would you like to know Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? This is Pastor John Short of the Gateway Bible Church in Gallatin Gateway, hoping you'll cast off the then a little news out of the Northwest. A Glacier Park spokesman reported that a 1-year-old grizzly bear was struck by a Burlington Northern train at Windy Point. The bear was feeding on fermented corn that had been spilled by a derailed train last winter. Then the livestock and agricultural report. Steers were dollaring up real good in Chicago market until corn futures came in lower. Winter wheat moved up. Then on came news for a guy like me. Hi, this is Dave Comline from the Montana Troutfitters Orbis Shop in Bozeman. Bob Jackman's fly shop at West Yellowstone reports some good fishing on the Madison with the number 14 Irresistible. And Royal Humpy, John Bailey at Dan Bailey's fly shop in Livingston, says that hoppers are not as effective on the Yellowstone as they have been. He suggests smaller fly patterns on the open river above Yankee Jim Canyon. Dave Comline caught his breath and shuffled his notes near the microphone. Dr. Ray Coney at the tackle shop in Innis reports some great days from his guides on the Madison. The bigger patterns are working well. Parachute hopper, Goddard caddis, also some flying ants, because the ants are starting to show in Barney in a big way. A flying ant hatch. I would have liked to have seen that. But right then, I was looking for my first big piece of Montana history. And I went on to the gold camp of Bannock, and Bannock is a wonderful little ghost town some of you have been to. And, wonderful history. I probably could have written a whole book on Bannock. In fact, my original book was 900 pages long, and the editor said, just can't do that, these people. Write another book later. So we cut it back to 400 pages. That's what you get. Bleached silver from blizzard and sun, Bannock's old wooden buildings were remarkably intact and had not been retouched by the Park Service. I wandered through the abandoned rooms of the Hotel Meade and the old saloons, houses, and livery stables. I trudged up to a gallows silhouetted against the sagebrush hills. This was Hangman's Gulch, where crooked men were made straight. Between the winters of 1862 and 1864, A band of road agents known as the Innocents murdered over 100 known victims and probably dozens more. As the robberies and murders intensified, local citizens organized the Vigilantes, a group sworn to secrecy who pledged to rid the countryside of criminals. The citizens of Bannock began to wonder about their handsome, soft-spoken sheriff, Henry Plummer, who had done time in California for second-degree murder. In his first months in Bannock, he killed his traveling companion in a bar, but this was overlooked because the man had been a scoundrel. Plummer then married a respectable woman, and as the elected sheriff of Bannock was on the verge of being made a U.S. Marshal when astute citizens noted that Henry's deputies went off on business or hunting trips at the same time the holdups occurred. The Vigilantes arrested Sheriff Plummer and marched him across the snow to Hangman's Gulch, to the gallows Plummer himself had built. A crowd gathered. Plummer demanded a trial, but the request was ignored. His crooked deputies were hanged first, and their feet had barely finished twitching when the men grabbed Plummer. The condemned sheriff went out like a gent. As they tied his hands and slipped a noose over his head, he said, "Give me a high drop, boys." Frontier justice cleaned up Bannock. The thieves appeared in other boom towns. New mining camps were born every month. And from 1862 to 1876, Montana produced over $90 million in gold. In the summer of 1864, Bannock was named capital of the newly designated Montana Territory. Although gold mining continued here for 50 years, most of Bannock's fickle population moved en masse to nearby Virginia City, which became the territorial capital in 1865. More mineral strikes brought more miners, and the population grew on a heady mixture of greed, backbreaking work, and optimism. He saw the log jail that Sheriff Plummer had built by private subscription, $2.50 from each citizen. Many refused, feeling it was cheaper and more satisfying to hang criminals than to house them. Leaving the jail, I exchanged greetings with a stooped man in his 80s, an old-timer who had lived in Bannock until the 50s. He had just come back to visit the house he was born in. "You can still see the blue linoleum on the old kitchen floor," he said. "Ever see any ghosts here?" I asked. "Ghosts?" he frowned. "That's why I left, by God." So the ghosts I really write about are metaphorical ghosts. They're ancestors. I didn't see any ectoplasms in boots and spurs and chewing snooze. And I went, the town I went to find the ghosts, the first town was Fort Benton, which, as many of you know, is about 40 miles northeast of Great Falls up on the Missouri River. And it's a great little town. The population was about 1,750 people in 1880, and it's now about 1,751 people, I think. So it hasn't changed too much. As I said earlier, I had two great-grandfathers. One was John Howard Conrad, who had two older brothers, William G. Conrad and Charles E. Conrad. Charles founded the town of Kalispell, and his house is a museum up there. He was a remarkable man, and so was William G. Conrad, who founded the town of Conrad. And the Conrads were entrepreneurs, and they were very ambitious and very sort of red-blooded people who had come from, been burned out of their plantations in Virginia and come west, as many Southerners had. And I chose them. They're my family, but they're also representative, I think, of a certain breed of men that came out west and eventually became a certain class of entrepreneurs. They were not in the big top sort of super varsity like William A. Clark or Marcus Daly or even Bonner in this town. But they founded towns, and there were many people like them. Founded towns of Havre or Shelby or Chinook or Lao City, various towns. And so they're one branch, and the other branch is my great-grandfather, William H. Hunt. Fort Benton was at the peak of its frontier wildness in 1879 when a tall, bespectacled gentleman with a neat mustache and a dusty bowler hat arrived. William Henry Hunt was just 22 and his only assets were a suitcase of dirty clothes, a good mind, and a certificate allowing him to practice law. Unlike the rough and ready Conrads, my other great-grandfather looked more like a native poet than a frontiersman. Hunt was from a family of American statesmen, being a direct descendant of Robert Livingston, who was co-author of the Declaration of Independence, the ambassador to France, and the chief negotiator of the Louisiana Purchase. Raised on one of the Livingston estates in the Hudson River Valley, Hunt was sent to Yale and became so ill with peritonitis that he was obliged to drop out. Tutored at home, he then worked as a customs clerk in New Orleans, studied law at Tulane, and wrote for the local newspapers. When his father took a judgeship in Washington, D.C., William followed his older brother to the boomtown of Fargo, Dakota Territory. There he worked as a surveyor, a newspaper reporter, and a law clerk until he passed the, quote, absurdly easy examinations, unquote. A freight train brought him to Bismarck, where he saw steamboats in the Missouri River pointing north. Nearly penniless, he charmed his steamboat agent into granting him free passage to Fort Benton in exchange for writing a newspaper article about the journey. The Missouri River was so low that year that passengers were obliged to disembark at Cow Island, 125 miles east of Fort Benton. The night before, a band of Indians had stolen the Army's horses, so the soldiers showed only cursory concern for the passengers. Hunt spent one night huddled under a blanket, and luckily met an old frontiersman, Redstone Condon, who carried freight for the Army on his 4-horse team. Redstone allowed Hunt to ride with him for $1 a day if he'd keep watch at night for Indians and horse thieves. The wide expanse of the plains and the great herds of buffalo astonished the young Easterner. We met several Indian parties, he said. Redstone knew their language and how to greet them in a friendly tone, using the few words that Indians employ and by making the signs with his hands by which they interchanged thoughts. Redstone also taught Hunt how to sneak up on a herd of buffalo from downwind. We did kill and left carcasses for the Indians. Hunt arrived in Fort Benton late one night in early October. The town was in full swing, with saloons, hurdy-gurdy halls serving rotgut whiskey to prospectors, bullwhackers, prostitutes, squaws, and squaw men. When he registered at the Overland Hotel, he noted that the clerk had lost both ears, frozen off in a blizzard. Over buffalo steaks in the dining room, he pumped the veterans for stories of Indian fights and gold strikes. Word soon got around that he was a lawyer. That winter, a schoolmate from Yale, Horace Buck, a Mississippian with a genteel drawl, arrived, and they immediately set up the firm of Buck and Hunt in a 2-room log cabin. The 8x10 office was sparsely furnished, and the living quarters in the back were just as primitive. Their beds were buffalo robes spread in the corner. The washstand was a packing case with one side open to hold dirty laundry. Their first client was a saloon keeper who had advertised in an Eastern paper for a wife to come west. The woman sent a pleasing photograph of herself in profile, and the man mailed her money for passage from St. Louis to Fort Benton. But when she stepped off the boat, and the eager bridegroom discovered that the unseen side of the woman's face was disfigured from some accident or illness, the man refused her. The situation was further confused by the lady's impecuniousness, wrote Hunt. What does impecunious mean? We'll have a question after that. Test. As the ratio of men to women, not counting prostitutes, was about 100 to 1, in Fort Benton, Horace Buck soon located a freighter who said he would be happy to marry the woman, and promptly paid off the disillusioned saloon keeper to everybody's satisfaction. For a time, the practice thrived. We defended men charged with murder, horse stealing, assault, selling liquor to Indians, robbery, forgery, and other offenses, he wrote. In the winter of 1880 to 81, the mercury dropped to 50 below. At night, the ink froze, wrote Hunt. So did the water in the pitcher in the bedroom. Even the kerosene in the lamps thickened. Their fortunes soon followed the thermometer. The wolf gnawed at the seat of our trousers in February. There was no business, no fuel, no money, no amusement, no comfort, no happiness, no work, no mails, no telegrams, no news, no traveling, no improvement, no dissipation, no food, no enterprise, no prospect, no hope, no law. Taken all in all, it was the darkest period of our legal and journalistic experience. Horace Buck took sick in February to make things more cheerful. Hunt was given a job as U.S. Collector of Customs. He basically did anything he could to survive. He was a surveyor, he and his partner were lawyers. They also bought the newspaper when the guy that owned it left town, and they ran that for a while and sold it to the next sucker that came along through town. But he wrote a lot about in his memoir about the great Western characters in that one day. And here's one of them. He wrote admiringly of the rough frontiersmen and their self-reliant character and distinctive humor. One favorite was a cattleman named Bowles, who was still dressed in a frontiersman's moccasins and buckskins. Bowles had a quiet, unobtrusive manner until he drank. Then he liked to fight. One time, the man he was abusing left him and went out of the saloon, wrote Hunt. Bowles, much enraged at what he called an act of cowardice, went into the probate judge's office and asked the judge to lend him a pair of heavy boots. "I just want to kick a cur over here on Front Street, and then I'll return the boots," he said. The judge was agreeable, so Bowles thanked the judge, took off his moccasins, put on the boots, and left the courthouse. He found his man in the saloon, engaged him in a hand-to-hand fight, gave him a terrific kicking, and after knocking him down, returned to the judge's office where he took off the boots, resumed his moccasins, and after courteously thanking the judge, left the courthouse. Gunfights and hangings were standard fare, but Fort Benton grew gentrified as white women arrived and churches were built. The white women resented Indian squaws living openly with frontiersmen and began a campaign against adultery. This is Hunt writing. Finally, a grand jury met and hailed into court many prominent citizens who were obliged to plead guilty to the charge of adultery. Some, particularly where there were children, married their squaws, while others sent them to the Indian reservation to rejoin the Indian tribes from which they had been taken. Just before Christmas, Hunt visited his family in Washington and attended a string of dinners, balls, and cotillions. One evening he was invited to the home of Admiral John Upshur and his wife with several lovely daughters. And before many weeks, I was betrothed to Gertrude, then 21 years old, the youngest of the three girls. Light hair, bright blue eyes, petite figure, and a vivacious nature, with a ready interest in my tales of the West. The combination overwhelmed me. After a romance by mail, William and Gertrude married in August 1882 in Brooklyn. For Gertrude to go west, she who had known nothing but the life of Washington society at Newport or Europe in the summers, as Hunt wrote, was like a heroine from an Edith Wharton novel being transplanted into the Wild West. Crossing the prairie by train and stagecoach, Gertrude had her first sight of Indians, drunken cavalry soldiers, and buffalo wolves. Fort Benton was a shock to her. Our bungalow was in the bottom, back towards the hills, wrote Hunt. Fort Benton was primitive. There were no paved streets, no running water, no sewers, no gas, no electricity, no telephones. We drank river water, which we hauled in a cart and delivered in barrels back of our house. They did, however, have servants, thanks to an abundance of, quote, Chinamen who were faithful and efficient. Indians were very much a presence in Fort Benton. One evening, while Gertrude was soaping herself in a bathtub, she looked up at the window to find an Indian in buckskins, mesmerized by her nakedness. She froze in terror, and the brave watched her for a good 5 minutes before moving away. When Hunt's first daughter, Elizabeth, was born in 1883, her nanny was a 10-year-old Indian girl named Ida, daughter of a squaw and frontiersman. She was very near savage when she came to us directly from the teepee, wrote Hunt, but with Gertrude's guidance, young Ida quickly learned English and the ways of more civilized life. Hunt's career took on a new stature when in November 1884, the Republican Party, a minority, submitted Hunt as a sacrifice candidate for Attorney General of his territory. He was told his chances of victory were slim. I did not like that attitude, he wrote, and was self-confident enough to believe that with a vigorous campaign, the Democratic majority could be overcome. Hunt rode hundreds of miles by stagecoach to greet crowds of miners and ranchmen and won by a narrow margin. At 27, he became the highest-ranking law officer in the Montana Territory. Livingston has always been a wild town. In 1873, the settlement was just a trading post. The superintendent for Indian Affairs in Montana wrote to his superiors, "Men pass by this shop and obtain whiskey, get drunk, come here on business, and annoy us very much." In the 1880s, most of the action was in the Bucket of Blood Saloon, which is now the Livingston Bar and Grill. There were fights every night between cowboys, railroaders, and drifters. One night, two sheep herders clashed outside, and one came back in with the other's severed head, which he dumped on the bar, saying, "Can you set my friend up here for a drink?" The Bucket of Blood was run by Kitty Leary, known as Madame Bulldog, who at 6 feet and 200 pounds often did her own bouncing when customers misbehaved. One person she threw out many times was Martha Jane Canary Burke, better known as Calamity Jane. More false legend festoons this braggadocious dame than any other character in the West. It was partly by her own doing, but mostly thanks to the dime novelists who fantasized about a woman who wore buckskins, handled a rifle like a trooper, and lived like a man on the frontier. It is true that she supported herself as a bullwhacker and was a master at cracking a 16-foot whip for the years of ox teams. She also participated in army and survey expeditions. She was not a scout with General Custer, as she liked to boast, and was probably never an Army scout of any kind. Little is known about her early life. Once Calamity became indignant over reports that she was a, quote, horse thief, a highwaywoman, a three-card Monte Sharp, and a minister's daughter. All the claims were false, she said, especially the latter. Most historians agree that she was born in the Midwest and was taken to Virginia City, Montana with her family in 1865. Her parents died when she was a teenager, and one biographer described her earliest occupation as a camp follower of railroad construction crews, quote, with none seeming to doubt her calling, unquote. One thing was sure, Calamity Jane drank whiskey and was a nuisance at bars around the West. She lived in a cabin in Livingston and supported herself by conning drunks and telling tall tales. She had many lovers, but claimed that the great romance of her life was Wild Bill Hickok. Though Calamity was with him when he died in Deadwood, South Dakota, one of her detractors said Wild Bill was, quote, much too fastidious a man to be involved with the likes of her, unquote. She cried over his grave and said she wanted to be buried with him. When she died of cirrhosis in 1903, she got her wish. Yet before she was buried, the womenfolk of Deadwood clipped off so many souvenir locks that a friend had to put a wire screen over the coffin to preserve what was left of her hair.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Barbara Thoreau. I own Fact and Fiction, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight to the Public Library for a reading discussion. And as I've been telling Pete this afternoon, we're just going to wing it, see what happens. You never know who's going to be here for a reading, what questions may arise. I'd like to thank the library for the facilities. Betty Ammon is running the camera for MCAT. This will be aired at a future date on the Undercover show that the Public Library provides through MCAT TV station. And I'm sure the library will post when it will be running. In early November. Great. Our guest tonight is Pete Fromm, who has 4 books that have been published, and he's still working on others. The first book was a collection of stories called Tall Uncut. Second one was Indian Creek Chronicles, which won a Pacific Northwest Bookseller Award and had also been read about a year ago on Listener's Bookstall on KUFM. And he, this fall, has a collection of stories called King of the Mountain and a new title called Monkey Tag, which is specifically directed to a younger audience. This was the day we chose to feature Monkey Tag and talk about writing towards a younger audience, but I'm sure once he reads a brief passage and opens things to questions, he may answer anything that you may have to ask about any of the things that he's written, or maybe some of the future projects that he's writing. So I will let Pete come up and read from Monkey Tag, and then we'll have some questions, answers, and maybe some further comments.
Well, the riffraff's here now. The young adults finally showed up. Barbara did say that this was going to be a question and answer period with all of Missoula's young adults. So thanks for coming, Kyle. And I haven't really ever done much reading from Monkey Tag because I had 3 books come out last month, and the other 2 companies paid me to go on tour with their books. And because Barbara told me to read from this book tonight, and I have a crowd of young adults in front of me, you're it. Monkey Tag is a book I didn't write for young adults. I wrote it, I started it 7 years ago, and sent it around for a while. It kept getting rejected, and a company mailed it back to me once and said, boy, we really, really, really like this story, but we think it would do much better as a young adult book because the protagonists are 12 years old. And I thought, well, okay. What young adult, I never even thought of that as a market. And so the only young adult stuff I could remember was those Scholastic book club things you used to get in school, where you'd go and beg your mom to write out a big check for you. And so I sent it to Scholastic. That was the only young adult publisher I knew. And Scholastic wrote back and said, boy, we really love this. It's pretty serious. It might do better as an adult novel. And so they've decided, they did it in hardcover. They bought it and decided to do it in hardcover, thinking that they could get both markets. And not that many people browse through the young adult shelf looking for a novel that might be good for an adult too. So I'm not sure exactly how the marketing ploy is going to work, but it's just out, so it'll be interesting to see. But Monkey Tag started, when I write, I really don't have any idea what's going to happen any given day. I get up and start daydreaming, working, I mean, in front of my computer. And I had a group of guys that I hung around with when I was probably 10 years old, and we lived real near Lake Michigan in Wisconsin, and the lake was like the mountains are here. That's where you went to play. And it was a real nice spring day in Great Falls, and I was thinking about what we'd be doing if I was 10 years old in Milwaukee again. And I thought how we always used to sprint down to the lake. First spring day after school was out, we'd go ripping down there, and we'd forget year to year that in June, Lake Michigan's about 40 degrees. And so we'd be all by ourselves on the beach, and we'd go blast into the water, blasting back out of the water. And we invented a game that we called the Sandman game. And this was, you had to go into the lake, dive underwater, and get completely wet. Then you'd run up high where the sand was all dry, and you dive down the sand and roll all over the place until you're completely covered with sand. And then there'd be 4 or 5 of us, and you had to lie down on the dry sand. It was a real nice sunny day. You had to lie like this and let the sun start drying the sand on you. And you know how when it sticks to you, it shrinks when it dries, and it crinkles up your skin and it itches. And lying like this, covered in sand, you itch in places you didn't know you had. And the game was the first person to scratch lost. And so there'd be 5 little guys lying on the beach. And finally, one guy couldn't handle it. He just blast up in the air and scratch all over. And we all laughed and did exactly the same thing, but he lost. And so I was thinking about that. And that really has nothing to do with anything. That's not what this book's about. But I thought about another game that those guys and I invented. And that was, we used to go up to the high school football field on Saturdays in the fall to play football. Just whoever showed up, pick up games. And one day, not enough people showed up, and we played catch for a while, and that was boring. Somebody had some balloons, so we filled those up with water and had a water balloon fight, and that got boring. Eventually, we crawled under the bleachers, and we're kicking around looking for junk in the trash under the bleachers, and somebody crawled up in the scaffolding under the bleachers. It was like a gigantic ladder, and so we're crawling up in the scaffolding, and that was okay. But pretty soon, somebody started swinging on the scaffolding, and then decided to monkey bar it. And the monkey bars are like this far apart, and the scaffolding was like this far apart. And when we were 10 years old, our arms reached about this far apart. So you couldn't swing, grab, let go, swing. You had to swing and just fly and catch the next one, and then use that momentum to Tarzan it down the row. And so we started doing that, and it was really fun because you had to go as fast as you possibly could, or you wouldn't have enough momentum to reach the next bar and catch it. That was pretty fun. And somebody, I'm not sure who, and decided that this would be even better if you played tag while you were doing it. And so we had a conference, and you can tag with your feet, tag backs count. No, they don't. Yes, they do. And big fight about that. Pretty soon we were playing this 3-dimensional game of tag underneath the bleachers. You could climb up, dive down, swing, and it was all really, really fast. My brother developed a technique of escaping a tag by letting go and just dropping down a couple levels and then snagging the next one and swinging away. And it was really fun. For about 10 minutes until physics caught up with us. And this is a sad but true story. This friend of mine, whose name was Bucky, his real name was Steve, but he had these 2 big buck teeth, and so he's Bucky forever. Yesterday I was telling this story in Corvallis schools, and I couldn't remember what his real name was. He was just Bucky forever. But he was the first one who missed one of the next bars, and he was down low, like 6 feet off the ground, and there's all these crossbars and stuff, and the first thing that hit after he missed this bar was his foot, which was no big deal, except that stopped his foot, so the rest of him kept going. So it pitched him head first to the ground, except for that last crossbar, which he hit with his Buckies. And he blew those out and some other teeth, and split his lips apart and cut up the inside of his mouth really badly. And, just got spun around, lay on the ground. There's, 4 10-year-olds walking down. Bucky, are you all right? And he was alive. And we picked him up and put his teeth in his pocket, and started walking him home. And he's bleeding like you do from your face, and it's dripping all over him, and pretty soon it looks like he got hit by a shotgun. And it's a long walk home, and as we're walking him home, we start to, in our minds, translate what this really, really fun game we invented is going to sound like explained to somebody's mom. It's this great game. You swing as fast as you can through the bars, and you play tag, and if you miss, well, you look like Bucky. But until you miss, it's really fun. And we realized we were dead. And so we brought Bucky almost all the way to his front steps and then split. And left his mom just to, find Bucky staggering through the house like he'd been axed. And running didn't help. His mom called our mom before we got home, and we never ever played that game again. And never really were that tempted to after I saw Bucky. What started this whole idea for this book was 9 or 10 years ago. I was home for Christmas and ran into Bucky, and they were able to save his teeth, which I'm sure he's eternally grateful, because now he still has these 2 huge buck teeth. And he's still known as Bucky. And I was driving back out to Montana from Milwaukee, and I always power drive that 20 hours straight, and you have lots of time to think. And so while driving out, I started to wonder, what would have happened to Bucky if he hadn't been 6 feet off the ground? He'd been at the very top of the bleachers. And I've done a lot of rescue work and stuff, and I was thinking, what could have happened to him? And so when I got home, I started to write a short story about a kid who falls from the top of the bleachers. And 400 pages later, I was done with my short story about what happens to this kid. And what happens to him, I have to tell you this, because eventually I read at these things usually, and I'll read you a part that's later on in the book. But the kid who falls is named Thad, and his brother's name is Eli. And they have the friends that they play this game with are Sonny and Max and Roger. Roger's this older guy. He's a year older, and he's kind of this big fat kid who's a bully. And the last thing, Thad falls down, and he breaks an arm, he breaks his leg, and breaks some other stuff. And the last thing that happens to him is he falls for a while without hitting anything, and hits the last crossbar right there. And he hits the spine so hard he doesn't break it, but it swells and pinches the cord, so he's paralyzed from the waist down. And so he spends a long time in a wheelchair and a long time in the hospital. And Eli is pretty convinced that he screwed him up. When they went to get Thad, they dragged him out from under the bleachers. And later on, the doctor mentioned something about how moving somebody after an injury like that can really screw him up. And so Eli figures he did it. And so Eli's campaign is to get his brother to walk again. And he's quite impatient with the doctors. And almost everybody else is trying to help Thad walk. He thinks he can do it better and faster. And the first day that he graduates from a wheelchair to those big metal leg braces and crutches. You've seen people in those, right? Good. He goes in those for quite a while, and finally they decide that it's time that Thad's going to practice walking without his crutches. And so Eli and Sonny and Max and Roger go down to the lake. This is where Sandman finally ties back into this. They go down to the beach because they know that Thad's going to fall over a lot. And they figure fall in the sand, it won't hurt as much. And he walks without his crutches, with his braces on. And it's like the most exciting thing that's ever happened in Eli's life. He can't stand it. He's so excited. Even though Thad walks like this. And he's pretty bad at it. He falls every time he tries to turn around and stuff. But it's great. Except Roger is there. And Roger's like, give me a break, the guy looks like Frankenstein. That's not walking. And which really pisses Eli off. But Roger's this big guy, and Eli wants to kill Roger, but he can't. Roger would kill him. And so Eli's mad and frustrated that he can't do anything about it. So he doesn't do anything. And then they take off his braces, and they all go swimming. And he can swim with the best of them because he doesn't have his braces on, and he's tooling around out there. And then they come back, and they're just hanging out on the beach wondering what to do next. And they had to take his braces off because getting him wet would destroy him. And then they're just hanging out on the beach on a really nice day in the summer, wondering what to do next. And that's where I'm going to start reading, if that's all right with you guys. Any questions? You got who's who? Thad's the guy with the braces. Eli's his brother. Roger's the big mean guy. Sonny and Max are these other two guys. Got it? Do you get it, Guy? If Guy gets it, everybody gets it. All right. Thad crutched around in a circle and asked, "Well, now what do you want to do?" Roger looked up. "I know where a wasp's nest is. Down here, right by the cave. One of them got me last time I was here." Roger twisted his arm around so they could all see the last trace of the welt left by the sting. They started toward the cave then, their hearts quickening. Since they could remember, a wasp's nest was something to be destroyed. Wasps stung, hard. "There it is," Roger said, stopping and pointing. The nest was a large one, gray and papery. It hung half hidden in the branches of a dogwood. "It's so big, it's bending those branches." "I know," Sonny whispered. All their voices were hushed. There were several wasps crawling around the entrance hole of the nest, and a few in the air around them. The nest hummed. "How come you haven't busted it yet?" Eli asked. Roger shrugged, and Sonny mumbled, "I don't know." "But this is perfect." Eli pointed to the lake. "We could run right into the water. They couldn't get us there." "What about our heads?" Thad said. "We'd have to breathe. We could splash so much they couldn't get close." "How long do you suppose they'd try?" "If they're getting blasted by water, I bet not long," Eli said. "They hate water." A wasp landed on Thad's elbow, and he brushed it away. "Suppose it might be better to swim away underwater?" No one answered for a moment. Then Eli said, You'd have to come up, though. They wouldn't know if they were waiting for you or not." "Yeah, they could sting you all over your head. Or right in your eyes, maybe," Roger said, shivering. "What if you sucked one in when you were taking a breath? It'd bite you on your tongue, maybe get all the way into your lungs." Eli giggled at the squeamish looks around him. "We gonna bust it or not?" Thad asked. Roger pulled up a stick and broke off a few extra branches, making a spear. "Ready? You can't do it this close." "I know, I'm just starting a spear." Eli picked up a stone. He grinned, knowing he'd hit the nest long before Roger, and from farther away, too. He thought of the way Roger laughed at Thad, walking without his crutches. Then Eli motioned to the others, and they started quietly toward the lake, everyone except Roger. When he was far enough from the nest, Eli stopped, twisting the stone between his thumb and first two fingers. He waved the others on toward the lake. Roger stood alone, facing the nest, twisting at a green fork of his spear. Eli could see the pale green edge of the bark as it spiraled around its stump. Roger'd be finished any second. Glancing over his shoulder, Eli saw Thad and Max and Sonny. They were halfway to the lake already, but they could still see the nest. Eli looked back at Roger and the nest. The stone would have to go just over Roger's shoulder. Eli couldn't believe Roger still hadn't caught on to the joke. The branch he was twisting snapped off, and Eli heard Roger laugh and toss the branch aside. Roger asked, "Ready again?" Eli was surprised by how far away he sounded. As he started to throw, Eli saw Roger turn. The sun dappled across his wide, placid back, and the giggle Eli'd been fighting died. He saw Roger blink, and he thought he heard Thad yell something. Then the stone was gone. No, the last thing I want to do is make them twins, because I didn't want people saying, "Oh, that's you and your brother." And so I started out, they were friends. They weren't even in the same family. But once Thad had his accident and then they were going to school, they had to be together almost constantly. And so then I gave up and said, okay, they'll be brothers. But then it worked out that, well, they got to be in the same classroom most of the time. It's pretty weird to have brothers the same age unless they're twins. And so I just gutted it up and said, okay, they're twins. And, then wrote my brother and said, Paul, I'm writing a book about us. So it's that, and then it was really easy. That solved a lot of problems, because I grew up, I lived in the same room with my brother from when I was born to when I left home when I was 17. And we went to different schools. My mom wasn't into cute twin things, plus we're not identical. He looks like he's from a different race. And he's got real black curly hair and brown eyes, and but having that, especially having him in a different school, having, this compatriot that's going through the same things you are, so, the day practically, you did a review of your day every night as soon as the lights got, hear your parents' bedroom door closed, and then it was, okay, Paul, what really happened in school today? Because you'd gotten the cleaned up version at dinner. So once I could work that into the book to where these kids could go through everything. And one of the big points in the book was this is the first time that these guys have to split. It's the first time, when Thad's doing all his hospital wheelchair stuff, it's the first thing he's done that Eli hasn't shared in completely. And it's going to be the first of many. That they're split on religion, split on different ways they're going to be going for the rest of their lives. And so that all works in, and how that's going to affect the book and then these kids forever. And so it was fun to work with that too. Well, if it was, I wouldn't be embarrassed. No, but it's because it isn't, because it's been fictionalized. I don't want people saying that's you.
Because it's been fictionalized.
Right, because it's not me, and it's not embarrassment. It's just, well, no, that's not correct.
Not really me.
Right. This is a character I made up. There's Rose has a great description. That my wife Rose doesn't read most of my stuff because she says it's just, she gets so confused in it. Either it has nothing true in it, but she spends her whole time trying to look for what was true in it, and then she reads it and she gets to realize she's to the end. Well, I didn't recognize anything there, but I really didn't pay attention to the story either. And or if there is some scrap that's true, that she said it's like having a dream where there's these things you recognize, but they're in all the wrong context, and they're all out of order and out of place, and she spends her time trying to reorder it the way it really happened. And the one story I wrote, it's about a woman telling her husband she's pregnant, and it happens on a fishing trip where in the middle of this woman trying to figure out some way to say this, her husband's fishing, and the wind affects him greatly. On his back cast, he hooks her in the head with his fly, and that really happened, but she wasn't telling me she was pregnant or anything at the time. So Rose reads it and goes, what were you thinking about when you were fishing that day? Who were you thinking about? So when somebody says, so this is really, 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 really about you, isn't it? You say, no, it really, really isn't. There might be little scraps like, I have a twin brother. All through school, I hated writing and reading.
Seems so natural, that's why I asked.
Well, it's probably because I haven't had any training. Like my last class in college, I took a creative writing 101 because I thought it'd be easy and I needed it to get a really easy A. And so I just took it as a blow-off class, and it happened to be taught by Bill Kittredge, and he said, wow, you're really good at this. You could do this for a living if you wanted to. So I became a park ranger, and then I had the winters off, and went back to school. Well, I didn't go back to school. I went back to a class. Rick DeMarinis was teaching a class here at night, and I just pretended I was in it. And he said the same thing. So I thought, wow, you know, two of these guys can't be on that wrong a length. And so I had winters off when I worked for the Park Service. And after a few years of just hanging out in the winters, I started to kind of mess around with it, and just to kill time. And it was fun. It was just daydreaming. And so then after a few years of doing that, I got up the guts to start collecting my rejections. And did that for several years. Got my first story accepted in Louisiana literature. And then I quit my carpenter job, and because I was a pro. And then I've just been doing it since then, full time. Thanks, you guys.